Delighted to welcome our regional response panel. We'll have all seen the discussions that went on at COP26 last year. Many of you have seen the recent reports that have come out, which are probably the angriest technical documents I've ever read. Like, that emotion really comes through as to just how imperative it is that we act now on climate change. So I'm delighted to be joined by three business leaders from the region who are going to talk through where we're currently at, where we're doing some great stuff, and also where there's rooms for improvement. So I'm going to ask all of the panellists to introduce themselves, and if I could start with you, Tricia.
Hi, so I'm Tricia Williams. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Northern Trains.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonny Sadler. I'm the Strategic Decarbonisation Manager for Electricity North West. I lead our work supporting businesses on net zero.
Fantastic.
And I'm Mark Atherton. I'm Director of Environment for Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
Amazing. So as you can see, a really great mix of approaches there, but really key bodies that we need to be able to succeed. So Greater Manchester kind of put quite an early marker in the sand and said, we're going to be net zero by 2038. The North West as a whole has come slightly back from that and said 2040 as a region, but still quite far ahead of the targets that we were seeing around 2050. So my first question, and I'll let any one of you jump in first with your thoughts on that, are those targets realistic or are we just dreaming?
Shall I jump in?
Jump in, do it.
I think they will be challenging. It's fantastic to have ambition, but if I just set out some challenges, I don't want to drop the mood, but just looking at the fabulous video there and the Castlefield corridor, all I can think about is we've got diesel trains sort of going past there. So if I think about our challenges from a transport point of view and on opportunities as well, the key thing for us will be our fleet. So we have 400 trains that run around the whole of the north. 33% are electric, but only 25% of the network is electrified. So we are going to have a strategy to phase out our diesel only. That could involve alternative power sources, battery, and that will be a challenge. So fantastic that we've got the ambition and we're right behind it. We're doing lots of things on our own decarb strategy, but there's some, realism as well that we have to look at where are we going to invest. And for us, electrification is a big part of that.
Absolutely, and I think it's when you start looking at any one chunk of it that you actually, right, well, what's the challenge here? And then that's obviously going to be multiplied many times. You touched on electrification there, so it feels sensible to come to Electricity North West next to talk about that. From your perspective, how realistic are those targets and what are the challenges for you to help us get there?
Sure. I mean, I think we'd absolutely echo the points Tricia's made, that it's certainly challenging, but I can look at this from a slightly different perspective in that it's challenging, but it's also increasingly necessary. And you touched on some of those angry technical reports that we've seen in recent months. Headline this week is that back in 2020, we were expecting the first 1.5 degrees warmer year to have about a 20% chance of happening by the middle of this current decade. So 20% chance. As of this week, there's now a 50% chance that's going to happen. So 1.5 degrees is a really important milestone in terms of the climate science, because what starts to happen after that is that parts of society and economy start to break down, crops don't grow, infrastructure can't function, people can't go to work, and those kind of temperatures and extreme weather impacts start to affect the well-being of people around the world. So if you want to look at it from a kind of global perspective, there's a non-negotiable necessity that cities like Greater Manchester, which can lead, absolutely do that. And we see Greater Manchester in a really good, growing international club of cities who take this agenda really seriously. So I'd say from a global perspective, it's a non-negotiable necessity. Coming a little bit closer to home, I also like to kind of try to look into what the opportunities are here. So, businesses are spending between 3 and 25% of all their purchase costs on energy back in 2018. So that's the latest figure we've got from government. That figure will be much higher today. So there's a real imperative for businesses right now to be taking action on this agenda, just in terms of protecting their bottom line. Businesses are also starting to see their customers increasingly demand action on this agenda. So if you want to do business with other businesses who take this agenda seriously, you'll find them writing it into their tenders. You'll find customers who are willing to pay a bit of a premium for greener products. And if you're not able to offer it, they will go elsewhere. So the agenda at a local level starts to look really interesting to me in that, yes, it's challenging, but we can start to articulate in a way which is increasingly relevant, particularly to businesses, articulating the economic opportunity. And we can talk to some of our citizens about cleaner air, access to better green space, healthier lifestyles through walking and cycling. So we're at a point now where the environmental agenda is starting to move mainstream, and that for me is what will drive the pace and scale of action we need to see in the coming years.
Fantastic, and so many great points in there, but the couple of things that really stand out for me there is that moving conversation from talking about the environment to talking about people. And I think they've been very separate for a while. It's like, this is what we need to do for the planet, and that happens, and kind of forgetting that it's people who live on the planet that are going to be impacted, and that difference in 1.5 and 2 degrees. And you know, you have a day like today in Manchester, and I'm coming in and it's quite cold. And I'm thinking, wouldn't an extra couple of degrees be delightful? It's only actually when you put that into terms of what's the human impact of that happening around the world, and as you say, those knock-on impacts for crop yields, for nutrition, for economic growth, that start to really kind of drive those very ambitious targets, that it's the right thing to do for us, it's the right thing to do for our businesses, and it's going to kind of combat climate change. Mark, from your perspective within the combined authority, you're obviously a little bit closer to those conversations around setting targets and what goes on at a regional level. Are we still seeing this as a realistic target that will hit, albeit a difficult target to hit?
So I think that's exactly right. I think it's a challenging but still achievable target. To achieve it, though, will require people to start thinking about it in a completely different way. We need to transform our energy system from where it is now to a completely different system. Realistically, in the next decade, we need to start seeing that happen. So we're behind where we need to be right now.
Can I ask how far, roughly? I'm not expecting you to have the exact figures here, but are we a bit behind, or have we got like more of an uphill battle than we might imagine?
So over the last 3 years, we've already used next year's carbon budget. So we are behind. In some ways, that's to be expected because it takes time to ramp things up. And there has been a lot of really good projects initiated that are doing all of the right things, but we need to find a way to take them to scale. So there's 2 key areas for us in Greater Manchester to really decarbonise quickly. We need to decarbonise our private transport, so that's private vehicles, cars, and we need to decarbonise the heat in our homes and businesses as well, but particularly our homes. They're our 2 biggest carbon emitters. And already we've seen £100 million invested in retrofitting of public buildings in the last 12 months, another £27 million invested in fuel-poor homes, so retrofit those in the next 12 months. And I think they're both the right sort of things to be doing, not just to overcome the sort of energy and cost of living crisis that we've got now, because these are real benefits for real people who are struggling to decide whether they're going to heat their homes or feed their kids. And so it adds the impetus of these things that we need to get on and do them. But the truth is that those schemes aren't of the right scale. And so we need to work with government and others to find other mechanisms to finance these schemes so that we're not doing small numbers of thousands and we're doing tens of thousands each year. And our ambition is to try and get to a point where we're retrofitting 60,000 properties a year. That's the sort of scale that we need to get to. And we're nowhere near that, but we are starting to see that trajectory increase. On private vehicles, I think the market will shift in private vehicles, largely because of some of the national policies that have come, which will move people away from combustion engines in the future, and people are starting to see that trend, and we're already seeing 10% increases in the number of electric vehicles as a market share. To pick up on wider points, there needs to be some incentives to allow people to do that, because electric vehicles are currently expensive. But actually, when you look at the overall cost, if you look at the lifetime cost of electric vehicles, they're usually cheaper to run for the average family. So that's again about finding investment opportunities for people to be able to spend now and pay over the longer term what will be hopefully a cheaper product. So all doing the right things, need to do more of it, need to find different ways of working, and this plays into the discussion we've just had about the public and private sector, particularly the investment sector, working together.
Fantastic. And again, some great points there. And obviously with that cost of living crisis, I've seen it positioned a lot in headlines, and I'm always there like on Twitter being like, calm down, Ilona, don't say anything. But it's been positioned as like, we just need to ditch net zero because everything's too expensive. And actually, when you look at it, it's exactly what you're saying. It's like actually the answer to bringing those energy costs down and stopping people having to make these terrible choices is actually more investment in those things. It's providing those investments up front that are going to lead to lower ongoing costs. So really, really pleased that you raised that. In terms of ramping up that activity, was there a kind of marked change because of having COP26 last year, that it was suddenly, it was headline news, it was hosted in the UK, there seemed to be a lot of chat around it. Did that chat die down and not go anywhere? Or have we actually seen businesses, public sector kind of ramp up activity off the back of those conversations?
I mean, I think that if not a kind of a particular moment that changed things, because moments come and go, don't they? COP conferences come and go, there's a huge amount of emphasis and excitement built up around them, and then people go back to their day jobs and their everyday lives. I think the thing for me that you start to see is the sense that this agenda becomes increasingly embedded in people's everyday lives. It gets increasing amounts of coverage in the media, for example. It gets increasing amount of coverage in conferences and events and around board tables. So it's a conversation that's now happening outside of rooms like this where we're going to focus on it for an afternoon. It's finding its way into people's everyday discourse. And, there's a new survey out to kind of substantiate this every week at the minute, but NatWest's latest sustainable business tracker, 1 in 6 businesses are looking to have some level of renewable energy generation on their property by this time next year. So that's quite a
hugely
marked
ambitious,
shift.
yeah.
1 in 3 looking to adopt electric vehicles or charging, and 20% looking to train existing staff or appoint new staff to focus on sustainability. So those are some of the kinds of everyday incremental changes that we're starting to see come through. From an Electricity Northwest point of view, we were just kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's in our business plan as COP26 was happening. And that was probably one of the things that helped to just get us over the line with the internal view that making a really ambitious commitment on net zero was absolutely the right thing to do. So it has been part of what we've been focused on for the last 3 or 4 years. As Cara said, it's now front and centre in our business plan, and I think you'll start to see that play through into other businesses' plans for the next 5-10 year periods as well.
Fantastic. And is that something that you're seeing as well, Mark, that kind of increasing pressure from businesses like this is what we need and we really want to drive that forward?
I think certainly some sectors have grabbed the nettle and are really trying to push forward with it. So your original question is, has COP changed anything? And I think what COP did do, perhaps more than anything else, was really focus the mind of the investment community on the role that they had to play.
Yep.
And how investment was going to be key for a low carbon transition. And it's sort of, as I was saying earlier, we've got to find ways to finance the transition now, because we haven't got time to wait 30 years. It will take that long to see that transition happen. So we need to find either patient debt or patient equity that is able to invest in those areas that we need to see transition happen. And if we make it easy for people, cheaper for people, and make it attractive, as in it's something that people want or aspire to, you will see the market shift, because that's how to get people to change their behaviour. It's not to wag fingers. Yeah. It's to say, look, here's a sexy new vehicle that's better than the one you've currently got, and there's a way that you can fund this. So this could be yours, and it's good for the planet. So I think that's my first. I think the second is around wider innovation, which I think has increased since COP26. So some examples would be, in Greater Manchester, we've just set up an energy innovation agency. We had a very successful launch a month or so ago. And we had 16 innovation businesses come to us and say, we need help to help us grow from the small idea that we've got right now into something which could substantially change the way that markets or energy systems operate. And so I'm really conscious that that new innovation will support businesses that have the new idea, a new way to transform the market and still make money. We're seeing more and more of them come forward. And then another way of trying to do market disruption is to provide advice and support to people where they feel there's a barrier. So if we're trying to convince people who potentially have some savings and want to invest it in their property, but don't know what to do, or they don't know who to trust, or they don't know where to go, we're going to try and put an offer into the market which will overcome some of those barriers, give people some surety, give some people some unbiased advice, and point people to companies, hopefully Greater Manchester companies, that can help them realise their ambitions. So I think I can see innovation has continued to escalate in the last 6 months since COP.
Incredible. And yeah, it's those kind of bits all fitting together. And we mentioned chatting to Cara earlier about how important that collaborative piece is. And, you know, I'm biased. I'm based in Greater Manchester. We've built a business here, but we do have a really collaborative community here that goes across. I'm not saying it's perfect. There's absolutely still going to be lots of challenges in bringing those people together, but there does seem to be a real appetite to do that. Can we just do that with that local regional appetite, or do we need national and international policy to make this happen at the pace we need it to happen?
We'll definitely need national policy. So if you look at infrastructure, a couple of themes coming out, collaboration, but also the whole system approach. Cara mentioned that before. So if we're going to reach these ambitious targets, we will need that integrated, holistic approach of collaboration. And some of that we can do locally, but some of that absolutely will need to be done nationally, because you're looking at big infrastructure. But I think the point that is really interesting, I just want to pick up on as well, is that people focus. You know, how do you encourage people to get out of their comfortable cars and get onto, for example, public transport? And I think COVID maybe heightened that feeling of I'm okay in my bubble, and now do I really want to get on
stats that were shared last summer as people kind of coming out of that was that office space in Manchester was at 20% and road usage was back at 80%. So exactly that you're saying, that it almost felt like that was going to be the weak link. I feel safe at home, I feel safe in my office, and I'm not necessarily then prepared to use public transport. I don't drive, so I was on the trains and I was one of like 3 people on it. I was like, I could not have more space around me, and it felt very, very safe. But there was definitely that perception that it was going to be the weak link in that journey. And are you seeing those numbers coming back now as restrictions are lifted, or are we still seeing a bit of a drop in public transport usage?
We've seen, you know, a recovery. Absolutely, it's had headwinds with things like Omicron, but the commuter market isn't where it was. But leisure market is really strong, particularly in this area. So it's been a different picture than it was pre-COVID, and we've got to understand what that means. So I think in terms of national policy, I think there's so much that national policy can do, but equally there's a lot that can happen locally, because the Northwest, for example, you know, the leisure market is so much bigger than it was, and the commuter market it hasn't recovered as well. But that's even worse, if you like, in down south, where they more relied on the commuter market. So we're seeing strong recovery, but that whole conversation with people about coming out of their cars, moving from you know, private cars to public transport, or diesel cars to electric cars, I think that's got to be a local conversation. I think that's quite difficult to have at a national level.
Yeah, so obviously we have that kind of like that big it's like no diesel cars sold after this point, which is great, but as you say, those conversations around how we make that happen and what that's going to mean happen a bit more locally. Mark, there's obviously kind of a broader transport strategy for kind of GM and leading into kind of Northwest. And we focus a lot on EVs, like they're shiny, they look nice, they cost a lot of money, there's advertising behind them. We're not necessarily having the same kind of funds put into advertising, walking or cycling. Something we've done really well at, kind of regionally at raising those. How important are things like active travel, public transport as part of that conversation to kind of decarbonise transport?
So the overall transport strategy for Greater Manchester relies on modal shift. So it relies on getting people out of their cars, whether they be electric or otherwise, and onto public transport or utilising bikes or walking. And we are starting to see now trials of other forms of transport that I think people will find quite engaging. So you've got the Lime e-scooter trial in Salford and Manchester. Yep. You've got the Beryl Bikes trial, again in Manchester and Salford and Trafford, I think. And I think these are opportunities, if people grab them, to think differently about how you move around a city.
Yep.
I do think that people need to feel confident on utilising public transport. Like you, I use public transport quite a lot, and I think it has come back quite a bit. You're not quite struggling for a seat as you were before pandemic, but...
I mean, sometimes you're struggling to stand, let alone to sit pre-pandemic, so it's absolutely not there yet.
But it is also about utilising public transport in the right way, so encouraging people to potentially, not everybody comes in on the commuter time, so that we're spreading that demand out over a little bit, so that people still feel secure, even while we still have a pandemic, but are able to use public transport sensibly and safely. I think we've done a lot to try and promote the B network, as you know, and the Mayor's ambition is to have a London-style transport system so that we increase the ease of ticketing. If you're using one form of transport, you can use it in another within a given geographic barrier, reducing the cost of overall using public transport. These are all things which are going to help people and support them to use public transport and other modes of transport to get around the city region, which will have a carbon impact, also have a health impact, and have the ability to be able to transform our region in a different way. If we link together all of our cycle schemes with biodiversity improvement or with sustainable urban drainage schemes, then it helps not just tackle climate change, but the adaptation that we need to go through to deal with some of the more difficult challenges of climate change, like flooding, for example, and biodiversity loss. If we do it in a systemic way, you have the ability to adopt and change different challenges to meet the same aim.
Yeah, it comes back to that holistic approach, doesn't it? That we might be doing it for one reason, but actually we've got benefits in lots of ways, and if we can coordinate them, it's much easier to get that buy-in. Just staying with transport, Jonny, obviously when we talk about transport, we talk a lot about like what we do as individuals, but obviously business travel is a huge part of that. What kind of role does Electricity North West play in having conversations with businesses around their fleets, logistics, the way that they're getting their staff, but also kind of goods around the region?
Sure. And Cara touched on this a little bit when she talked earlier about leading by example, and where that commitment came from was conversations with businesses and some of our domestic customers saying, we're up for doing something on energy or net zero or the sustainability thing, but can you help us understand what that means and what that looks like? So our work over the last 3 or 4 years has been to try and unpick what does it mean for a business, not a distribution network operator, but a business with staff and buildings and vehicles to go on its net zero journey. And we've put quite a lot of effort into not just electric vehicles, but into sustainable transport more widely. And the starting point for that project, or that programme, if you like, was conversations with our staff. They are the people who drive our vehicles every day, who commute into work. So whatever the strategy was we were going to put in place, it had to absolutely have our staff at the heart of it. So that's where we started, understand people's travel behaviours, understand what they already do that they'd like to do more of, and understand where some of the barriers are. So from a public transport point of view, we offer salary sacrifice on season tickets, so that your season ticket for a train, for example, can come directly out of your salary without a huge amount of effort. From a cycling point of view, we've removed the cap that we had on our cycle to work scheme. It was £1,000 per bike. You can get a pretty nice bike for £1,000, but some of the electric bikes that are out there aren't really within that price range yet. So we've removed that cap to enable people to get on electric bikes. And we've also made it much, much easier for people to have an electric vehicle. So last year when we did our company car renewals, 74% was sufficiently incentivised and empowered to make the shift to an EV. And when we ran a survey for this year's renewals, which hasn't happened yet, 92% said that they were interested in making the shift to EV. So we've been really careful to ensure that we've covered all bases, if you like, and not just promoted one mode, precisely because of the reasons that Mark and Tricia have touched on, really, is that we need a sustainable transport strategy in a mix of modes, not just a focus on one or two of them. And we feel that what we've done is very relevant and very replicable. And we'll talk to any business who wants to understand a little bit more about the practicalities of how do you make that shift and help your staff to do the same.
Fantastic, thank you. And so that leading by example bit's been so important, because it's not about like that wagging figure that you mentioned. It's about being like, we did it, here were the challenges, this is what you can learn, and kind of help people along that journey. So final question I'm going to put to each of you in turn. For businesses in the room or watching this online, if there was one thing that they could go away now and do and be like, that is what is going to help us get closer to net zero, what would the starting point be? And I'm going to start with you, Tricia, at the end.
What a question to end with. Start with me. I think it's just having a strategy. Actually, it can be ambitious, but until you translate that into a plan, it can't be deliverable. So actually having a strategy, having a plan, and chunking that down to do the first phase, whatever that might be, whether that be recycling, whether that be your staff scheme, whether that be collaborating with your third parties, have that first step as part of that wider strategy.
Brilliant. So it's that step back, sort your strategy out, and then start moving through it. I believe we do have a talk coming up later today, which is going to talk a little bit more around some of that strategy piece as well. Jonny?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump to electric vehicles. So it's, government have put in place a whole series of incentives and grants to encourage and drive action in this space. So if not right now to adopt them for your fleet or even for your individual vehicle, now's the time to start planning. Because of the way that government have structured the financial incentives, for every single employee you get into an EV out of a petrol and diesel car, a business will save about £1,500. So again, that point, whether or not you're interested in the climate and the environmental side of things, there's a really strong business case for every business in the region to be starting to make the move to electric vehicles.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, Mark, what would your top action be?
So I think I probably agree with the idea that every business needs to have a plan. Most businesses are different, and each business will have its own ranking of the impacts that it's having, depending on what it does. So having a target and having a plan is definitely key, because it allows you to prioritise those things that are going to have the greatest impact. That's the first. I think the second is, sorry, am I now three?
Go on, why not?
I think businesses need to remember that they're employers as well as corporate entities. Yep. So engaging with your staff and encouraging the staff to take advantage of some of the opportunities out there, or just raising awareness of what they can do in their personal lives, not just in their transport to and from work, because obviously that's part of your own emissions, but in how they can change the way that they either get to work or the way they heat their home or so forth. And the third, I think, is for businesses who aren't sure, there's some great resources out there. Electricity North West have a fantastic website, but there's also a website for Greater Manchester businesses called Be Net Zero, which tells you about the business support opportunities that are available and what the sort of steps are that businesses can take to get them onto a road to net zero.
Fantastic. Some absolutely brilliant tips there that we can certainly all go away and start acting on. So huge thanks to the panel again. Always really interesting to kind of see what's going on behind the scenes a little bit, that's behind some of those numbers that we share.